My family invaded my home, moved my bed, and still said I owed them everything. There is this very specific kind of silence that hangs in an office after 9 at night when the only sounds are keyboards, the hum of old air conditioning, and the cleaning crew dragging trash bags down the hallway. And for years, that was basically the soundtrack of my life. I was the one who stayed logged in after everybody else went home, the one who answered messages from my boss at ridiculous hours, the one who treated sprint deadlines like they were life or death, even though nobody outside our little tech bubble would have cared at all. My calendar was color-coded, my inbox was organized, my performance reviews were perfect. And at some point, I blinked and realized I had become that cliché of the woman who married her job. For a long time, I told myself I was fine with it. I had my own house in a quiet suburb outside a mid-sized city, a 3-bedroom place with ugly beige carpet and ancient kitchen cabinets. But it was mine. And I had signed those closing papers with my own hand after years of saying no to brunches, trips, and basically anything that was not paying down debt or stacking savings. I was the first person in my family to buy a house. And my mother loved to brag about that to her friends, like she had personally negotiated my salary, while also making those little comments about how it was a shame there was no husband or kids running around in it. So when my phone lit up late one Wednesday night with my mother's name and 3 missed calls in a row, I already had that little knot in my stomach before I even picked up. She never called me that many times unless something was wrong or she wanted something big. I remember I was sitting at the tiny dining table I used as a desk, laptop open, eating cold leftovers straight from a container when I finally hit callback. She launched straight into it. No hello, no how are you. She said my father had been in and out of the clinic, that his blood pressure had been all over the place, that their landlord had no compassion and had raised the rent again, that they were looking at having to move in the middle of his health crisis. She kept using that phrase, health crisis, like she was pitching a drama series. And every time she said it, my chest tightened a little more. I could hear the television on loud in the background, my father talking to someone, my sister laughing at something on her phone. And I remember thinking, if this is a crisis, it sounds awfully casual in that living room. Then she said it. The thing I think she had rehearsed before calling me. She said, "You know, you have that big house all by yourself. Your father is sick. Families help each other. You are the oldest. You always were the responsible one." And I swear, even though I am a grown woman with a mortgage and a job where people call me when things break, those words, "you are the oldest," still hit me like I was 8 years old being told to clean up my sister's mess. It sounds dramatic, I know, but that line was basically the soundtrack of my entire childhood. If my sister forgot her homework, I was the one sent back to school with it. If she spilled juice on the couch, I was the one scrubbing it while my mother lectured me about setting a good example. Even when we were teenagers and she snuck out to meet some guy from a party, it was me my parents woke up to keep them company until she got home. Like my job was to absorb their anxiety so she could stay the baby forever. Somewhere along the way, being responsible stopped meaning taking care of my own life and turned into quietly fixing everybody else's disasters without making a scene. So hearing that same phrase as an adult, with a mortgage and a team at work depending on me, it did not feel like a compliment. It felt like a sentence. I tried to slow her down, asked what exactly had happened with the apartment, whether there were any other options, whether they had talked to the landlord about a payment plan. She brushed it all off. She said they were already packing, that my sister had never been able to keep a job long enough to help with anything, that my father could not be stressed right now. Every sentence was a brick in a wall of guilt she knew exactly how to build around me. I heard myself say, "Maybe you can stay here for a little while just until you figure things out." And even as the words were leaving my mouth, my stomach flipped. I told her it would have to be temporary, that my place was not some kind of long-term solution, that I had routines and responsibilities and deadlines, but I might as well have been whispering into a hurricane. She grabbed onto the yes and ignored everything else. She said, "You are an angel. We just need 6 months, just until we are back on our feet." And then she called my father into the room and put me on speaker so he could tell me how grateful he was. By the time I hung up, my food was cold, my laptop screen had gone dark, and my carefully scheduled life suddenly felt like something fragile that I had just agreed to hand over to the people who had never once treated my boundaries like they meant anything. I sat there for a while in that weird half-light from the laptop, doing the math in my head that I always do when I am scared. 6 months, I told myself. Half a year. People survive worse things than that. I tried to picture it like some temporary project at work with a start date and an end date and a clear deliverable. Keep everyone fed and housed until they can sort themselves out. I even texted a friend from the office about it, and she sent back a string of shocked messages followed by, "Girl, you are nicer than me," which should have been my first real clue. Instead of hearing that as a warning, I took it as proof that I was doing the right thing. That is the trap with being the dependable one. People applaud you for lighting yourself on fire and then step back so they do not get burned. They arrived 3 days later with way more stuff than anyone who was supposedly temporarily displaced should own. My sister came in first, carrying one small box on her phone, talking about how the neighborhood was cute and how she could totally see herself meeting someone from a social app around here, like my house was now her dating base. My mother followed with a huge bag of frozen food she had bought for the house, which later turned out to be mostly things she liked. And my father shuffled in behind them, leaning heavily on the doorframe, making a point of breathing loudly like every step was agony. I had already set up the guest room for my parents and cleared out the small office to turn it into a space for my sister. I labeled shelves in the bathroom and made a list of house rules on a piece of paper that I taped to the fridge. No loud music after a certain hour, clean up after yourself in shared spaces, let me know in advance if people were coming over. Simple things that any adult should understand. I went over it with them like I was onboarding new hires, my project manager brain trying to create order. They nodded and smiled and said all the right things in the moment. My mother put her hand on my arm and told me I worried too much. My father said he would barely be around because of appointments. My sister did that thing where she said, "Relax, it is not that serious," which somehow always meant she had no intention of following whatever had just been agreed on. The first couple of weeks, I kept telling myself it was an adjustment period. Yes, my utility bill doubled almost immediately because somehow every light, television, and fan in the house had to be on at all times. Yes, the fridge looked like a competition show where contestants have 5 minutes to use every ingredient they can find and leave the rest open on the counter. Yes, I found my sister's damp towels on the floor more than once and had to fish a clump of her hair out of the shower drain. But I kept thinking, it is temporary. 6 months, I can handle 6 months. My work did not slow down just because my house got crowded. If anything, it got more intense. We had a huge rollout coming, and my team was constantly on the edge of burnout. I would be in the middle of a call with my boss trying to sound calm while talking through dependency charts, and my mother would come knock on the door to ask if I wanted some of the lunch she had made. Like that conversation about keeping the kitchen quiet during my work hours had never happened. My sister started using my home office desk when I was not there, leaving coffee mugs and open notebooks full of half-baked business ideas all over it. One afternoon, I was halfway through a presentation to a client when I heard my mother yelling at my sister from the hallway because she had used the wrong pan, and the two of them started going back and forth so loudly that my client actually asked me if everything was okay at home. I froze, smiled, and lied about some neighbors having construction done. When I hung up, my hands were shaking. I tried to talk to them that night. I reminded them that I had said I needed quiet during work hours, that this was not a vacation house, that we had agreed on certain rules. My mother's face hardened immediately. She said, "We are doing our best. Do you think this is easy for us? Your father is sick, we lost our home, and you cannot handle a little noise?" My sister rolled her eyes and said I was being dramatic, that I always acted like the office was the center of the universe. It was like that pattern I had grown up with snapped right back into place. I was the one expected to adjust, to absorb, to be understanding, while everyone else did whatever they wanted. I went to bed that night in my own house and felt like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. It is a strange kind of homesickness when you are technically already home. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to my parents' television through the wall, and my sister's laugh echoing down the hallway, and it felt like the house itself had shifted loyalty. The walls that used to feel like they were holding me suddenly felt like they were closing around me. I caught myself tiptoeing to the kitchen for water so I would not disturb anyone, apologizing out of reflex if I bumped into my mother in the hallway, wiping down the counters extra carefully like I was trying to prove I deserved to be there. I remember thinking, if a stranger walked in right now and had to guess who owned this place, they would not pick me. 6 months came and went, and nobody even mentioned moving. My mother started talking about the house like it was her permanent address. She changed where I kept the spices in the kitchen, rearranged my pantry because it made more sense her way, and started referring to the guest room as their bedroom, like it was some sacred space. My father spent most days in the living room watching television, occasionally limping dramatically to the kitchen to pour himself a drink. And anytime I asked if he had looked into new housing options with my mother, he said he did not want to stress her while she was taking care of him. My sister, who had sworn she would use this time to get back on her feet, spent entire days lounging on the couch, scrolling through her phone, talking about vague projects she was working on, none of which involved actual job applications. When I asked how the job search was going, she said things like, "The economy is trash right now," or "I am focusing on my mental health. You, of all people, should understand stress," as if she had ever held a job long enough to burn out. Anytime I tried to bring up the timeline we had originally agreed on, my mother would either deflect or go on the offensive. She would say I sounded like some cold landlord, that I had forgotten where I came from, that if they had thought that moving in with me meant being thrown out like garbage at the first opportunity, they would have never come. She never once acknowledged that it had been her idea, her pressure, her manipulation that got them into my house in the first place. My breaking point came on a Friday night after one of the longest weeks of my career so far. We had just finished a brutal phase of a project, and I had barely slept. I came home late, fantasizing about taking a long shower and collapsing into my bed, only to walk into my bedroom and stop dead in the doorway. My bed was gone. Well, not gone exactly. It had been moved. My dresser was in a different place. Half my clothes were piled on a chair, and my nightstand was sitting crooked against the far wall like someone had dragged it across the floor without lifting it properly. I followed the sound of my mother's voice down the hallway and found her in what used to be the guest room, now rearranged with my bed neatly made, my dresser against the wall, my lamp on a different nightstand. She smiled like she was giving me a tour of a surprise renovation. She said, "We had to switch rooms. Your father needs the bigger space for his recovery, and the other room has better light in the morning. Besides, you are barely here. It makes more sense this way." She did not even pretend it was a conversation. It was a decision, made without me, in my own house. Something in me snapped. All the swallowed comments, the late nights, the guilt and the resentment and the tightness in my chest, it all boiled over at once. I asked her how she thought it was okay to move my things without asking me, to take over my bedroom like it belonged to her. She shrugged and said, "We are family. What is yours is ours. We raised you. You owe us." Like that settled it. My father appeared behind her in the hallway, leaning on the doorframe, looking at me like I was the unreasonable one. My sister watched from the other room, arms crossed, clearly enjoying the show. I shouted, "I am not going to pretend I handled it gracefully." I said things I had been holding back since childhood, about always being the responsible one, about carrying everyone's weight, about how they had never taken my needs seriously. My mother's face turned into something hard and unfamiliar. She said I was selfish, that I was choosing a house over her husband's health, that I was just like those cold people on television who abandon their parents. Afterward, I locked myself in the small room that was now apparently mine and cried into a pillow like a teenager. The walls felt closer somehow. My own house felt like it belonged to someone else. The next morning, when I apologized for yelling, my mother did not apologize back. She accepted it like it was the natural order of things that I should be the one to say sorry. I should have done something big then. I should have drawn a line in the sand and said they had to go. Instead, I went back to work on Monday and pretended nothing was wrong, because it was easier to deal with annoying clients than to face the reality that my family had turned my home into theirs and pushed me into the margins. The money disappeared a few months later. It was a random Tuesday. I was on my lunch break, sitting in my car outside a coffee shop scrolling through my banking app because I was bored. I was not even expecting to see anything unusual. My savings account had been my security blanket for years, a pile I had built up slowly, month by month, saying no to everything fun, reassuring myself that at least if something went wrong, I would not be one paycheck away from disaster. When I saw the balance, my brain literally refused to process it for a good 10 seconds. I blinked, refreshed the screen, and checked again. The number was smaller. Way smaller. A chunk of money that should have been there was gone, siphoned out in one clean transfer. My first thought was that there had been a mistake, some banking glitch or fraud situation. I called the number on the app, went through the endless menu, and finally got a human on the line. I told them I was seeing a transfer I did not recognize. They pulled up the details and told me in a calm voice that made me want to scream that the transfer had been made from my own logged-in device a few days earlier, authenticated with the usual security checks. I argued with them. I said I had not made that transfer, that I would remember moving that much money. They asked if anyone else had access to my phone or my passwords. I said no, automatically, because that had always been true in my mind. Then, like a replay in my brain, I remembered leaving my phone charging on the kitchen counter while I took a shower after a hellish day of meetings, leaving it unlocked because I was home and tired, and did not think twice. By the time I hung up with the bank, my hands were numb. I drove home in a kind of autopilot fog, went straight to the kitchen, and stared at my mother and my sister sitting at the table like it was any other day. My father was in the living room with the television volume up high. I asked them, straight out, if they had used my phone for anything while I was in the shower a few days ago. My sister's eyes flicked to my mother so fast it might as well have been a confession. My mother sighed, dramatically, and said, "We were going to tell you. Your sister needed capital to start her business, and we knew you would not understand. It is family money." The room spun. I asked them how much they had taken, even though I already knew. My sister started explaining her business plan, some vague idea about turning her hobby into a brand, talking about followers and potential clients like she was pitching to an investor. Except the investor had never been asked. My mother kept saying things like, "We were going to pay you back, and you never even used that money. It is just sitting there." I do not remember every word I said in response. I know there was yelling. I know I said the word stealing, and my mother acted offended. Like I had accused her of something low when all she had done was move my savings without consent. She said, "We are your family, not strangers. You act like we broke into your house." And I had to walk out onto the back porch to keep from screaming. That night, instead of binge-watching something or working late to distract myself, I sat at my dining table with my laptop open, not on a work call, but searching for phrases like rights homeowner, family refused to leave, and eviction relatives no lease, and what can I do if my own family stole from me? I read forum posts from people who sounded way too much like me, stuck between fear of being the bad guy and the reality that the people hurting them shared their blood. The next day, I made an appointment with a lawyer. Walking into that lawyer's office felt like crossing some invisible line I could not uncross. She was calm, efficient, and had that way of looking at documents like they were simple puzzles she had solved 1,000 times. I told her everything, probably more than she needed to know. I told her about the 6-month promise that had turned into more than a year, about the room swap, about the disappearing money, about how I was the only name on the mortgage and all the bills. She listened without interrupting much, just asked a few clarifying questions here and there. Then she laid it out for me in plain terms. Legally, my parents and my sister were not tenants. There was no lease, no rental agreement, no payment history. They were guests who had overstayed their welcome. She said we would need to serve them a notice to vacate, giving them a set number of days to leave, and that if they refused, we could file an unlawful detainer action and have them removed. Hearing those words, "have them removed," made me feel sick. I kept seeing my father's face, the way he played up his health, my mother's theatrics, my sister's constant whining about how hard life was. I told the lawyer I did not want to throw anyone out on the street. She said very calmly that I was not throwing anyone anywhere. I was reclaiming my home after a year and a half of being taken advantage of. We also talked about the money. That part was messier. Because the transfer had technically been made from my own device with no obvious signs of hacking, the bank considered it authorized. To go after it, I would have to allege fraud against my own family, and even then, recovery was uncertain and would be a long process. The lawyer did not sugarcoat it. She said, "You may not see that money again. You have to decide whether the emotional cost of chasing it is worth it." I went home with a stack of papers in my bag and a knot in my stomach that made it hard to eat. Serving those papers felt like lighting a match in a house soaked in gasoline. When the notice to vacate was delivered, my mother called me at work, sobbing so loudly I had to step into an empty conference room. She said I had betrayed them, that I was kicking my sick father out, that everyone would find out what kind of daughter I really was. My father sent me a long message about sacrifice and gratitude, reminding me of all the times they had gone without so I could have shoes or books. Like that somehow justified them draining my savings account without asking. My sister went on some social media app and posted vague statuses about being stabbed in the back by your own blood, clearly fishing for sympathy. A couple of cousins messaged me asking what was going on, telling me maybe I should have more patience. None of them offered me a place to live, obviously, but they were ready with opinions about my boundaries. After that call with my mother, I packed a bag and checked into a cheap hotel near my office. I told myself it was just to get some mental space while the notice period ran its course. The truth was, I could not stand being in my own house with them knowing what was coming, walking on eggshells every time I passed them in the hallway. Those weeks at the hotel were surreal. I would go to work, go to the little gym in the basement afterward, shower in that cramped bathroom with the flickering light, and fall asleep in a bed that was not mine, while strangers rolled their suitcases past my door. Meanwhile, my actual bed was in a room down the highway occupied by my parents. That is where I met him. By the way, the guy who would eventually become my emotional support through all of this. He was at the gym nearly every evening, running on the treadmill like he was trying to outrun something, which, honestly, I could relate to. We started with casual nods, then small talk about the broken water cooler and the terrible music they played in the background. One night, while we were both stretching on those cheap mats, he made some joking comment about corporate prison, and I laughed too hard, that wet laugh that comes when you are one sentence away from crying. He noticed, obviously. He asked if I was okay in that careful way where he did not want to pry but also clearly was curious. I surprised myself by telling him more than I meant to. I said I was staying at the hotel because my family was living in my house and I was in the middle of trying to evict them. He blinked, then said, "Wow, you just skipped all the small talk," and I apologized, but he shook his head and said it actually made him feel better about his own mess. He told me about his own version of family drama that had left him questioning what loyalty was supposed to mean. It was the first time I had talked to someone who did not immediately jump to defending the idea of family at all costs. He did not tell me to be more understanding. He said, "That is messed up," and meant it. We swapped stories while pretending we were still focused on our stretches, like if we kept moving our bodies, the emotional weight would feel lighter. After that night, it stopped being just polite nods at the gym. We started timing our workouts around each other without ever officially agreeing to it. One evening, he asked if I wanted to grab something to drink from the vending machine in the lobby, and we ended up sitting on those awful plastic chairs talking until the front desk staff started shutting off lights. He told me how he had spent years bailing out relatives who called only when they needed something, how he had eaten instant noodles for weeks to send money he never saw again. I told him about the bedroom switch, about the stolen savings, about the part of me that still felt like a bad daughter for being angry. There was this moment where he just looked at me and said, "You know, none of this is normal, right?" And I laughed because I honestly was not sure I did know that. Being seen like that, without the lecture about respecting your elders or the guilt trip about blood being thicker than water, felt like someone had opened a window in a stuffy room. Back at home, things escalated exactly how the lawyer had predicted. My parents did not leave by the date on the notice. Instead, they hired some lawyer of their own who sent a dramatic letter claiming that they had established residency, that they received mail at my address, that I could not just throw them out. It was all written in this formal, righteous tone that made me want to burn the pages. My lawyer was unimpressed. She filed the unlawful detainer action. There were more papers, more dates, more signatures. I, the person who had grown up swearing I would never be in any kind of legal battle, was now literally suing my own family to get them out of the house I had bought on my own. The day the sheriff came to enforce the lockout, I almost backed out. I almost told my lawyer to forget it, that I would rather live in a hotel forever than see my mother's face when she was told she had to leave. I stood in the driveway, my hands shoved deep in my pockets, watching the marked car pull up, feeling like the worst person on earth, and also knowing that if I did not go through with it, I would never again believe myself when I said I had boundaries. My mother opened the door before the sheriff even knocked, like she had been waiting with a script. Her eyes were red, but her voice was steady and loud enough for the neighbors to hear. She accused me of everything she could think of, from abandoning them to choosing strangers in uniform over her. My father stood behind her, silent and pale, leaning on his cane like he was an extra in a courtroom drama. My sister filmed parts of it on her phone, narrating under her breath for her followers about how she was being unfairly evicted. The sheriff was professional and detached. He explained they had a set number of hours to gather essential belongings, that anything left would be cataloged and stored. He said it in the same tone I use when I walk stakeholders through a project plan, as if this was just another task on his list. Inside, the house already felt like it belonged to someone else. My mother had put her decorative touches everywhere, little framed sayings about family and faith on the walls, a throw blanket draped over the back of the couch, her spices taking up half the counter. Seeing it like that, knowing they had put all this energy into nesting in a place they never contributed a cent to maintain, made my guilt war with a fresh wave of anger. They loaded up a rented car with suitcases and boxes, my mother talking the whole time about how cruel this was, how she would never have done this to her parents, how one day I would regret it. My sister kept updating her social media story, asking people to pray for them. None of them looked at me like a person. I was just the villain in their version of events. When they finally drove away, the silence that settled over the house was nothing like the office silence I was used to. This one was heavy and thick, filled with echoing memories of slammed doors and raised voices. I walked from room to room, opening drawers, assessing damage. There were little scars everywhere, scuff marks on the floor, chipped paint, stains on the carpets that had definitely not been there before. In my old bedroom, now reclaimed as mine, I sat on the edge of the bed and let myself breathe. I did not feel victorious. I felt exhausted and a little hollow. But underneath that, like a faint new layer, there was this sense of something that almost felt like safety poking through. Cleaning that house became my weird therapy. I scrubbed surfaces, boxed up things they had left behind, rearranged furniture. I opened windows and let stale air out. It was like I was physically scraping off their presence, one baseboard at a time. I found the most random little relics in the process. A receipt shoved behind the microwave for takeout I never ate. A half-finished craft project my sister had started and abandoned on top of the fridge. My mother's handwritten notes stuck inside my cookbooks, telling me how I should change recipes to make them more proper. Every time I tossed something into the trash bag, it felt petty and huge at the same time. I kept stopping to sit on the floor, back against the wall, and just breathe. It was not like one of those makeover shows where everything is magically spotless in a montage. It took days, then weeks, of small, boring work. But slowly, the house started to look like a place a single, slightly burnt-out project manager might actually live in again, not a chaotic family hostel. The hotel guy, whose name I eventually learned and who eventually moved from being gym acquaintance to guy I texted too much, came over to help me change the locks. We joked about how this was the most intense meet-my-place moment anyone could have. But when he put his hand on my shoulder afterward and asked if I was okay, I had to look away to keep from crying again. Work, of course, kept going. My job did not care that my personal life had exploded. If anything, my boss seemed relieved when I was back in my own house and not using spotty hotel Wi-Fi for calls. I threw myself into tasks, partly because I am wired that way, partly because it felt good to have a situation where effort resulted in predictable outcomes. But my family did not disappear. They just changed tactics. The extended family came next, of course. My aunt called to hint that my parents staying with her was creating tension, that relatives were talking. I let her fish for sympathy, asked if anyone complaining had offered their own spare room, and got silence. She changed the subject. Meanwhile, my sister found new creative ways to annoy me from a distance. She wrote cryptic posts about some people who cared more about property than people, about how success turns you into a monster. A few mutual friends reached out, curious, asking if everything was okay. I got tired of giving polite half-answers. Eventually, I sat my boss down and told her the basics. Not because I wanted to overshare, but because I needed at least one person in my professional life to understand why my phone sometimes buzzed with chaos in the middle of the day. Then came the credit alert. I got an email from a credit monitoring service I barely remembered signing up for. It said there had been an attempt to open a new card in my name at some store in a town near where my aunt lived. My heart sank before I even clicked the details. When I called the number to confirm, they told me the application had been flagged and denied because some information did not match exactly. But whoever had tried had all my basics. I did not have to play detective to know who it was. My sister had never been subtle. When I called my aunt to ask if my sister had mentioned anything about needing money recently, there was that telling pause again. Then my aunt admitted that my sister had been talking about fixing her situation, and that there had been drama at a store the other day, but she did not know the details. I did something then that I never imagined I would do. I filed a police report. Sitting in that small office at the station, talking to an officer about my own sister trying to use my information to get credit, felt surreal. I kept wanting to apologize, to explain that we were not criminals, that we were just messed up. But the officer was matter of fact. He said it was better to have a report on file now than to wait until real damage was done. He did not care about my family dynamics. He cared about the law. A couple of weeks later, my aunt called again, this time frantic. She said my sister had been picked up for trying to use a fraudulent card at a store, that my mother was hysterical, that they needed help with legal fees. She shifted from pleading to scolding in record time, saying things like, she would not be desperate if you had not thrown them out, like I had forced my grown sister to commit fraud. My mother finally called me herself after that, her voice raw from crying and, of course, rage. She said if I had just let them stay, none of this would have happened, that I owed it to them to help with bail, with a lawyer, with whatever they needed. For once, I did not crumble under the weight of her words. I told her calmly that I had already helped more than anyone reasonably could. I reminded her that they had stolen from me, that they had violated my trust, that my sister's choices were not my responsibility to clean up. She accused me of being heartless. I let her talk until she ran out of breath and then said, "I cannot be your solution anymore," and hung up. It was my gym guy, who, by then, was definitely more than just gym guy, who suggested therapy. He did it gently, in that way where you know the person has thought about saying it for a while and was just waiting for the right moment. He said, "You have been in survival mode for so long you do not even realize it," and I hated how right he was. Therapy forced me to sit with the parts of myself I did not particularly enjoy looking at, the part that equated saying no with being a bad daughter, the part that believed I was only valuable if I was useful, the part that kept hoping my family would wake up one day and magically become people who respected my boundaries. My therapist helped me untangle guilt from responsibility. She did not tell me to cut anybody off or to run back and fix everything. She just kept asking, "What do you actually want?" which honestly, I had not thought about in a long time. Sometimes I would leave her office feeling like I had just worked out a muscle I did not know I had. Other times I would sit in my car afterward and cry because we had touched something old and tender, like the memory of being a kid watching my mother praise my sister for being so carefree while scolding me for being too serious in the same breath. We talked about parentification, which is a fancy word for they turned you into a third parent before you were ready. Hearing it labeled out loud made me both relieved and angry. I had spent so long thinking I was simply built to carry more, that maybe I was dramatic for feeling crushed. Turns out I was just a kid doing adult-level emotional labor nobody had any business handing me. Life did not pause while I was unpacking childhood in 50-minute sessions once a week. Work actually got busier. All the hours of extra effort I had thrown in over the years started to pay off in visible ways. I got tapped to lead a huge new project, with a title bump and more money than my younger self would have believed. When my boss told me, I had this bizarre flash of my mother saying, "You think that job will love you back?" And I had to laugh. No, my job would not love me back, but it could at least pay for new floors, which at that moment felt like a decent consolation prize. Around that same time, I got an update about my sister through my aunt. Apparently, the credit card fraud charge got her a plea deal. Community service, probation, and a fine she would be paying off for a long time. My aunt said my mother had dipped into her own savings to cover part of the legal fees, and there was this edge in her voice like she was waiting for me to feel guilty or reach for my wallet. I thanked her for letting me know and said nothing else. My sister's consequences were not mine to carry anymore. Then my aunt called with real emergency news. My father had had a heart attack. Hearing those words, I felt that familiar old panic rise up. No matter how angry I was, no matter how much distance I had tried to create, he was still my father. And the idea of him in a hospital bed made my chest hurt. My aunt said he was stable but needed procedures that would be expensive. She said my parents were drowning in medical bills, that collection agencies were already calling. I waited for the guilt avalanche, for the certainty that I had to swoop in and save them. It did come, but it was softer, layered with the things I had been learning in therapy. I could care without sacrificing everything. I could help without handing over my whole life. So I made an offer. I told my aunt I would loan them a set amount of money to help, but it would be exactly that, a loan. I drafted a simple contract with repayment terms, interest that was more symbolic than anything, and signatures required. I could practically hear my mother's outrage across the distance when my aunt passed the message along. At first, my father refused on pride alone. Then reality apparently sank in. They signed. For 3 months, my mother sent small payments every month, usually with a short message attached that was almost polite. There were hints, little digs about how families should not need contracts, but she made the payments. It was a strange feeling seeing money move in the other direction, from her to me, under clear terms. The payments continued for about 8 months total before my mother called to say they had paid what they could, but covering the rest would take longer than expected. I did not push. The point had never been about squeezing every dollar back out of them. It was about proving to myself that help could come with terms, not as a blank check they were entitled to. We agreed she would keep sending smaller amounts whenever she could, and I filed the contract away knowing I probably would not see the full sum. That was fine. I had gotten something more valuable than money back, proof that I could draw a line and hold it. Meanwhile, the guy from the hotel gym was no longer the guy from the hotel gym. He was my boyfriend. He was the person who made dinner with me in my kitchen, who asked how therapy went without making it weird, who respected my need for space when family drama flared up. He was also offered a position in a different city, a promotion that would move him a few hours away. When he told me, he looked like he expected me to panic. Instead, something clicked into place. My company had been hinting about opening a bigger office in that same region, and within a couple of months, an opportunity came up that felt suspiciously like timing lining up in my favor for once. I got an offer for a director-level role there, more responsibility, more pay, and maybe more importantly, a completely new zip code where nobody would randomly bump into me at the grocery store with an opinion about my family. We moved. Packing up that house, the one that had gone from being my proud accomplishment to a battleground, was bittersweet. I sold it instead of renting it out. I thought about keeping it as an asset, but the idea of being tied to that address, that street, those memories, made my skin crawl. Handing the keys over on closing day felt like exhaling something I had held in for too long. I sat in my car in the driveway for a few minutes afterward. Fingers still curled around the steering wheel, staring at the front door that had seen some of the worst fights of my life. There is this weird grief that comes with letting go of a place, even when that place hurt you. Little flashes kept popping up in my head. The first night I slept there on an air mattress with takeout containers on the floor. The time my internet went out in the middle of a work call and I nearly cried until I fixed it. The morning I discovered my bed had been moved without my consent. It was all stacked on top of each other. The good and the awful, like layers of paint you cannot quite separate. Driving away, watching the house get smaller in the rearview mirror, I half expected to feel instant freedom. Instead, it was more like loosening a knot. It was not all gone, but it was not choking me anymore either. The new place was smaller but brighter. It did not have a history. We picked out furniture together, argued about curtains, laughed about how domestic we sounded. I set up a home office that nobody else used. There were no passive-aggressive notes on the fridge because we actually talked to each other. 6 months after the move, he proposed. It was not some cinematic event. He did not hire a band or spell anything out in lights. We were in the kitchen, in sweatpants, making pancakes on a lazy Sunday. He slid a ring box across the counter and said, "I want to keep doing this with you. All of it. Even the messy family stuff. If you want that too." I cried, obviously, and I said yes, obviously. A younger version of me might have been low-key disappointed that there were no fireworks or dramatic announcements in front of a crowd. I grew up on those cheesy movies where proposals involve choreographed dances and viral videos, where the whole world is supposed to clap for you. But standing there with flour on my shirt and my hair in a messy bun, it hit me that nobody had ever just quietly chosen me like that before. My family chose me when they needed something. My parents chose me because I was convenient to lean on. My sister chose me when she wanted a place to land after blowing up her own life. He was choosing me on a regular, ordinary morning when nothing was on fire. No performance, no audience, just us and a pan that was about to burn if we did not turn the stove off. When we started planning the wedding, the question of inviting my family hung over everything like a storm cloud. My therapist asked me to imagine different scenarios and see how my body reacted, which sounded silly until I actually did it. Thinking about my mother at the ceremony made my shoulders tense. Imagining my sister anywhere near the event made my stomach twist. But I also knew that excluding them completely would ignite a different kind of drama, and I was tired. In the end, I decided to invite my mother only. Not my father, not my sister, not the extended chorus. Just my mother with very clear expectations from the start. No speeches. No bringing anyone else. No using the event as a stage to perform our relationship. She came alone, wearing a dress that was a little too formal for the small venue we had chosen. She hugged me at the door and whispered something about how beautiful I looked. And for a second, I saw the version of her I remembered from when I was a kid. Then she started making comments about how empty the family side of the room looked without cousins and uncles, and the moment slipped away. During the reception, she tried to steer me to a quiet corner to talk about my father, about how he wanted to see me, about how life was short, and what if something happened and I never forgave myself. I listened long enough to be polite. Then I said calmly that my wedding day was not going to be about reconciling with anyone who had never truly apologized. She looked offended, then wounded, then started to cry, just enough for people nearby to notice. My husband stepped in, gently redirected her back to her table, and I went to dance. After the wedding, she gave me an envelope with a handwritten letter from my father. I did not read it that night. I waited until we were back home in our new living room, the decorations from the party still in a pile by the door. The letter was exactly what I had expected and dreaded. There were apologies, but they were woven together with phrases like, "We all made mistakes," and "Things got out of hand on both sides." It was less a confession and more an attempt to rewrite the story so we were all equally guilty. I folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, and tucked it into a drawer. Not because I wanted to keep it, but because throwing it away right then felt like giving it more power than it deserved. Life, for a while, settled into something resembling normal. Work was demanding in a different way at the new role, but I was good at it. My husband and I built routines, inside jokes, a playlist of songs we played when cooking on Friday nights. We talked about kids in that abstract, maybe someday tone, the way couples do when they are still enjoying just being two people against the world. A year and a half into the marriage, someday finally showed up. I found out I was pregnant on a random Tuesday morning before a meeting. The test line turned pink faster than I was ready for. I sat on the bathroom floor, my work clothes on, staring at that little piece of plastic and feeling about 6 emotions at once: joy, terror, disbelief, excitement, and, somewhere under all that, a cold thread of dread about what this would mean for my already complicated family. Telling my husband was the easy part. He cried, I cried, we laughed, we started making lists of names, we joked about whose nose the kid would get. Telling my therapist was next. She congratulated me and then, very gently, asked if I had thought about what role, if any, I wanted my parents to play in our child's life. I had not really. The idea of my mother holding my baby made my skin prickle and my chest ache at the same time. There was this tiny, hopeful part of me that pictured a soft, kind grandmother who would bake cookies and tell stories. And there was the much larger realistic part that remembered bank transfers, screaming matches, and manipulation. I decided to do nothing for a while. To not reach out, to not make declarations, to just grow this baby and figure it out later. Of course, life had other plans. My mother found out anyway, through the extended family grapevine. Someone saw something on a social app, or maybe my aunt let it slip. My mother sent a small package to our new address. She must have gotten it from a distant cousin, with a tiny blanket and a card that said, in wobbly handwriting, that she would love to meet her grandchild when I was ready, that she was trying to respect my space. It was the most measured message she had ever sent me. I stared at that card for a long time. Part of me wanted to call her right then, to hear her voice, to share this thing that was so huge in my life. Another part remembered her sobbing on the phone while my savings vanished, remembered being called heartless for not paying my sister's bail. Then, like she had a radar for emotional vulnerability, my sister tried to get in. She somehow got my new number. I still do not know exactly how, but I suspect a cousin who cannot keep anything to themselves, and called one afternoon while I was at home, feet up on the couch, one hand on my stomach. I did not recognize the number, so I answered without thinking. The second I heard her voice, all my muscles tensed. She started with a soft, "Hey," like we had just seen each other last week. Then she launched into this whole speech about being in recovery, about working on herself, about wanting to rebuild our relationship. She said she had heard I was pregnant and that she wanted to be an aunt, that she wanted to start fresh. If I had not gone through therapy, that call might have broken me. I might have clung to the hope in her words and jumped at the chance for a redo. Instead, I listened to the part of me that had learned to look at patterns, not promises. I asked her point blank if she understood why we were estranged. She said, "Things got crazy. We all did things." That same both sides language my father used in his letter. I told her I could not do this, that I could not invite chaos back into my life, especially not with a baby on the way. She tried to guilt me, said I was punishing her forever, that people deserved second chances. I said she had already had more chances than most people get. Then, before I could talk myself out of it, I hung up and blocked the number. 2 days later, my mother called, pretending at first that she had no idea my sister had reached out. Then, inevitably, she folded it into the conversation. She said my sister was really trying, that she had suffered, that being cut off from me was harder on her than on me. She said a kid needs a big family, that my child would be missing out on cousins, on grandparents, on all these things she painted like a Hallmark commercial. I sat there, one hand on my belly, phone pressed to my ear, listening to the same old script in a slightly new costume. Then I did something I would have never thought possible a couple of years ago. I said no. Not angrily, not dramatically, just a simple, firm no. I told my mother I was open to some version of contact with her if she could respect the boundaries I set, but that my sister was not going to be part of my child's life. Not right now. Maybe not ever. She cried. Of course. She called me cruel, said I was using my baby as a weapon. I let her talk. Then I said I had to go and hung up. After that, I put my phone on silent and sat in the quiet, feeling the baby move and reminding myself that protecting someone sometimes means other people will be upset with you. When our daughter was born, everything else shrank in comparison. Labor was long and messy, and nothing like the birth stories people post online with soft music and perfect lighting. I was exhausted and sore and cried when they put her on my chest, not because it was some magical moment out of a commercial, but because it was overwhelming and real, and I was terrified I would screw it up. Nobody talks enough about that first night home when the hospital staff is gone, and suddenly there is this tiny person in a bassinet next to your bed who does not care that you used to manage million-dollar projects. She cried. I cried. My body hurt in places I did not know could hurt, and every time she made a new sound, I jolted upright like someone had fired a starter pistol. My husband kept reminding me we were a team, that we could Google things, that calling the pediatrician at odd hours was allowed. But that old part of my brain that had been trained to handle crises alone kept trying to take over. I caught myself apologizing to the baby for not knowing what I was doing, which, looking back, is both ridiculous and exactly on brand for me. At home, the nights were long and the days blurred together in that newborn fog. My husband was amazing, showing up for all the small things that do not make it into social media posts. He did the dishes, changed diapers, held the baby so I could shower, told me he loved me when I snapped at him for no good reason. My mother sent another package a few weeks after the birth, with a simple note saying she hoped we were healthy and that she was there if we needed anything. There were no guilt trips in that particular card. No subtle jabs. I did not respond. Not because I was playing some power game, but because I did not know what to say yet. And I refused to rush myself into a relationship I was not ready for, just to make someone else feel better. Eventually, though, I made a choice. Not a dramatic one, not some never speak to me again speech delivered over a holiday dinner, just a quiet decision I came back to every time my phone buzzed with a number I did not recognize. I started asking myself a simple question before reacting to anything involving my family. Does this move me toward the kind of life I want my kid to grow up watching? If the answer was no, then I did not do it. That meant not answering every guilt-soaked message, not stalking my sister's online posts to see what narrative she was spinning this week, not letting my mother's mood dictate mine from several states away. It felt selfish at first, like I was suddenly hoarding peace I was supposed to share. But the more I practiced, the more it felt like learning a new language. One where no was a complete sentence and I cannot do that was not a betrayal. I decided that my daughter would know that she had a grandmother, but that the terms of that relationship would be mine to set, not my mother's. I did not owe anyone automatic access just because they shared DNA. I owed my kids safety and stability. So when my mother called again months later, sounding calmer than I had heard her in a long time, and asked if she could visit just once to meet her grandchild, I did not say yes right away. I told her I would think about it and talked it over with my husband and my therapist first. We came up with rules. The visit would be short. My sister would not come. There would be no conversations about money, about past grievances, about who was at fault. If my mother tried to twist the day into an opportunity to perform pain or demand reconciliation, the visit would end. When I finally called her back and laid all that out, there was a long silence on the line. Then she said in a small voice I did not quite recognize, "I will take what you are willing to give." It was the closest thing to humility I had ever heard from her. The day she came over, I was more nervous than I had been walking into any boardroom or client presentation. My daughter toddled around the living room, clutching a soft toy, while my husband hovered nearby, a quiet, solid presence. When my mother knocked, my heart stuttered. She looked older. That was my first thought. Time had not been gentle. She opened her arms, hesitated when she saw me stiffen, then let them fall. She did not barge in. She waited to be invited. It was new. We sat on the couch. She asked if she could hold her granddaughter. I nodded, slowly, and watched like a hawk while she cradled this tiny person in her arms. There was a softness in her face I had not seen since I was maybe 5 years old, before she started molding me into the responsible one. For most of the visit, she stuck to safe topics. She asked about my job, about the city, about our apartment. She told a few stories about me as a child that did not involve backhanded compliments. Every so often, I caught her looking at me like she was trying to figure out who I had become. Near the end of the 2 hours we had agreed on, she started to drift toward old patterns. She mentioned my sister, said she was doing better, that it would mean so much to her to meet the baby. I felt my jaw clench. I reminded her gently but firmly that we had agreed not to talk about that. She pulled a face, said I was being stubborn, that life was short. I stood up, took my daughter back from her arms, and said, "This is where we stop for today." She did not take it well. She asked for just a few more minutes, tried to stretch the visit, tried to test the edges of the boundaries like she always had. I walked her to the door anyway. She cried again, but there was a layer of something else there now. Maybe understanding that this version of me was not going to bend the way the old one did. After she left, I put my daughter down for a nap and stood at the window for a minute just watching the street. There was no patrol car outside, no shouting, no neighbors staring, just regular life happening. Cars driving by, a dog being walked, someone unloading groceries. Inside, the house was quiet in that way I used to chase with late nights at the office. But this time, it was my quiet. My choice. I am not going to pretend everything is neatly wrapped up. I still get texts sometimes from unknown numbers that I suspect are my sister. I still get occasional updates through the family grapevine about my father's health, about bills, about drama that does not touch my doorstep anymore. There are days when the word daughter sits heavy on my tongue, when I wonder if I have gone too far, if I am being unforgiving. But then I remember what it felt like to walk into my own bedroom and find my bed relocated without my consent. I remember opening my banking app and seeing that hole where my savings used to be. I remember signing legal papers against my own family because they would not hear the word no in any other language. I remember sitting in a hotel room, alone, listening to my mother call me heartless while my sister posted about being a victim. And I look at my daughter, sleeping in a room decorated with colors we chose, with walls painted by hands that respect each other. And I know that whatever anyone in my family thinks of me, whatever labels they throw around in group chats or holiday gatherings I do not attend, I have done the one thing nobody ever modeled for me. I chose to stop burning myself down to keep everyone else warm. Maybe that makes me the villain in their story. In mine, I finally got to be more than a supporting character in a drama I never agreed to star in.